Hey everybody, this is Chapter 3 of Karl Korsch Study in Western Marxism by Patrick Goode. Chapter 3 is titled Labor Law for Factory Councils. The second phase of Korsch's writings on the struggle by the working class for direct control over production concerns the factory councils, Betriebsräte, rather than the more broadly based workers' councils, Arbeiterräte. This change reflects the changed focus of political life during 1920 to 1922. In this period, the Arbeiterräte were non-existent, having in fact lost most of their effectiveness by the end of 1919. As Korsch pointed out, quote, already in November 1919, only a tiny band of, quote, municipal workers' councils was left of the Revolutionary Workers and Soldiers Councils of 1918, but since the end of 1919, we have no longer had political councils in the revolutionary sense, end quote. Korsch. They were replaced by the factory councils, which were given an added importance by being granted legal status by the Factory Councils Law of 1920. The legal recognition of the factory councils was a sign that the revolutionary moment had almost entirely disappeared and that the normal rule of law had returned. But why had the utopian revolutionary movement of the earlier period given way to a more peaceful political philosophy of parliamentarism and the struggle for piecemeal reforms? The answer given by the theorists of the Communist International was that it was due to a combination of the treachery of the SPD, the misleading role of the quote centrists, the USPD, and the failure of the revolutionary elements to achieve organizational cohesiveness by forming their own independent party. During this period, the quote need for a Leninist party quote was not as yet widely argued by the Comintern and its constituent parties as it was subsequently, e.g. in the later campaign for quote Bolshevization, of which Korsch was to be a victim. Korsch could take a somewhat different position, recognizing that the political councils, which had revolutionary implications, had been replaced by the much more conciliationist factory councils, which did not pose such a threat to the power of the state or the employers. He argued that they had failed not for want of a revolutionary party, but because, quote, the most important organizational failure was that, for the most part, the political councils were not chosen by the proletarians themselves, arranged according to factory and profession, which alone would have corresponded to the meaning of the councils, but were chosen by the socialist parties, usually it is true, on the basis of parity, end quote. Korsch. Before I discuss Korsch's writings from this period, I propose to examine the important changes taking place in political life and Korsch's position in relation to them. Until 1914, there was only one socialist party in Germany, the SPD. The war and the failure of the majority of the SPD leaders and their trade union counterparts to oppose it had caused deep fissures to appear in its ranks. The first open signs of such splits were the formations of the USPD in 1917, and further to the left, but within its ranks, the Spartacus League of Rosa Luxemburg. This process was hastened by the experience of a period of the Social Democrats in office immediately at the end of the war. Korsch's exasperation at the passivity of the Socialization Commission was shared by the thousands of workers who had suffered the war patiently in the utopian expectation of radical changes in the post-war period. Nonetheless, at the first election to the National Assembly in January 1919, the SPD still had a long lead over the USPD, but the USPD had made such inroads into the traditional support of the older party, the industrial working class, that in some areas, including Korsch's own, Thuringia, it was in the majority. In the 18 months after the end of the war, the USPD continued to grow rapidly, more than doubling its membership and electoral support. After his disappointment with the inactivity and ineffectiveness of the Socialization Commission, Korsch himself was looking for more radical solutions and so joined the USPD. But his membership of that party did not last for long, since he was shortly to be attracted to an even more radical party, the KPD, Communist Party of Germany. This was formed as a separate party from the Spartacus League on the 30th of December 1918. For some time it remained very small, even by comparison to the USPD. The situation was soon to change drastically. At their March 1919 party conference, the USPD had already come out in favor of Soviet government and the quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. This marked a decisive break with the convinced democratic parliamentarians of the SPD. When this was confirmed at the December 1919 conference, reunification with the SPD was clearly excluded. Instead, unity was to be sought with the official Comintern party in Germany, the KPD, and an application was made to join the Comintern. Accordingly, a conference was held at Halle in October 1920 to debate this momentous question. After an impressive oratorical performance from Zinoviev, it was decided to accept the 21 conditions for membership of the Comintern and the fusion of the two German organizations. If he had any reservations about the decision at this time, Korsch did not express them in public. There is no record of his having spoken at the conference. It is not clear exactly when Korsch joined the KPD, but it was probably toward the end of 1920. At any rate, Korsch soon began to contribute to the communist newspaper for Thuringia, the Neue Zeitung. Subsequently, Korsch was a prolific contributor to the communist press. Because the majority of these articles are only of occasional interest, and though competent, are not more than that, his journalistic activity will not be discussed directly. The main focus of his work for the first 2 years of his membership of the KPD was on the political problems of the day, in particular the law on factory councils and the establishment of legal factory councils, in place of the extra-constitutional political workers' councils. To understand the problem more clearly and to see how it relates to the earlier writings on socialization, the progress of such legislation since the socialization movement of 1918 to 1919 must be briefly reviewed. The Socialization Commission had been content to dissolve itself after the vague legislation of the 3rd of March 1919 concerning the socialization of suitable economic enterprises. At the same time as the Socialization Commission was pondering its ineffective proposals, the first steps in setting up a system of factory councils and appropriate legislation for them had been taken. On the 23rd of December 1918, an order was passed regulating the operation of collective agreements and making provision for workers' committees to supervise their execution. This legislation marked a drastic improvement in the workers' legal position in comparison with their status under the Hilfsdienstgesetz of 1916 and previous legislation. It was formally codified in the Weimar Constitution, 31st of July 1919. Article 165, paragraph 1 stated, quote, "Workers and employees shall be called upon to cooperate with employers and on an equal footing in the regulation of wages and working conditions as well as in the entire field of the economic development of the forces of production. The organizations on both sides and their agreements shall be recognized. Workers and employers shall, for the purpose of looking after their economic and social interests, be given legal representation in factory workers' councils as well as in district workers' councils, and in a workers' council of the Reich." End quote. The bill was finally sanctioned on the 18th of January 1920. The special Betriebsrätegesetz, factory council law, stated its purpose as follows, quote, "To safeguard the common economic interest of employees, manual and white-collar workers, with respect to the employer, and to support the employer in carrying out the aims of the factory, factory councils are to be set up in all factories employing, as a rule, at least 20 workers." End quote. How did the Communist Party, Korsch's new political allegiance, respond to the changed situation? It eventually adopted a sharp change of tactics. The direct insurrectionary struggle for power was not an immediate task. The new orientation was towards the, quote, "struggle for the masses for the conquest of power," end quote. This term was not achieved without a severe internal struggle. The Spartacus League, the forerunner of the KPD, had rejected participation in the National Assembly, and at a different level, the factory councils were a similar kind of constitutional organization. The left wing of the KPD was as much opposed to factory councils as it was to parliament. It stood instead for revolutionary councils. At times during the period 1919 to 1920, large sections of the party supported these ideas, and only the skillful maneuvering of Levy, backed by the authority of Lenin, succeeded in steering the party away from such a position. But this was not finally achieved until the end of 1921. For example, one of the severest disagreements arose over the abortive putsch in central Germany, led by sections of the KPD, the, quote, March Action of 1921. After this incident, the line of the 3rd, June 1921, and 4th, December 1922, Comintern Congresses won the day in the KPD. This was for patient work in the mass organizations of the working class, particularly in the trade unions, which had grown enormously since the war. However, quote, reformist they might be, the constituent parties of the Comintern were not to neglect any opportunity to work in such organizations and were to utilize any concessions made by the employers. The factory councils presented great opportunities for this kind of work. This policy was followed for 2 years from the end of 1921. How successful was it? The KPD did gain significant support in the employed working class. Its cooperative attitude towards other parties, as instanced by the United Front policy, began to yield real successes in this period, especially in the factory councils. At the first Congress of the Factory Councils, October 1920, convened by the ADGB, the German equivalent of the TUC, the left as a whole was very much in a minority. In the next 2 years, there was a steady swing leftwards, so that by the 11th ADGB Congress in 1922, the politics of cooperation, Arbeitsgemeinschaft, were actually condemned. In September of the same year, the KPD convened its own conference for factory councils, which Korsch reported on from the Neue Zeitung. This was attended by over 200 delegates from all over Germany. From Korsch's own district, Thuringia, there was a narrow minority against sending delegates to the conference, but elsewhere the movement even extended to traditionally less radical areas, such as Breslau, Schlesien. What was Korsch's role in this movement? Before we examine this question, we must look at the general level of development of his ideas at this period. In the first year of his KPD membership, his published work consisted of 7 newspaper articles for the Neue Zeitung, which are not of any great significance. What he wrote in the following year, 1922, was of much greater importance. In February and March 1922, the communist publishing house, Viva, issued 2 pamphlets by Korsch, Quintessenz des Marxismus and Kehrpunkte der Materialistischen Geschichte auf Assen. I think the one is Quintessence of Marxism, or the Essence of Marxism, and the other one, I'm assuming that's the materialist conception of, or something about historical materialism is my guess. As the latter discusses questions more relevant to the book Marxism and Philosophy, it will be discussed in the next chapter. The pamphlet, Quintessenz des Marxismus, resulted from the educational classes in basic Marxism which Korsch taught at KPD members. It was meant to give a popular outline of Marxism, as Korsch pointed out in his preface, quote, it helps the beginner to make an independent study of the Marxist system, end quote. In addition to the ABC of Marxism, quote, it deals with the difficult questions of Marxist theory of economics and society, relating them to each other, end quote. Korsch. The very brief first section, 2.5 pages, attempts to explain, quote, the Marxist theory of society. Apart from a rather curious, quote, diagrammatic representation of human society, end quote, displaying Marx's base superstructure schema, the remainder of the pamphlet gives a simplified version of Marxist political economy. To the question of political rights and their relation to the productive process had not been clearly answered in What is Socialization? Quintessenz der Marxismus answers the question explicitly. The opening page states, quote, the democratic republic state guarantees its citizens political freedom only, but it does not yet do away with social unfreedom, end quote. Korsch. The first clause is rather unfortunate in view of the fate of the Weimar Republic. Even at the time, it was a rather curious thing to say in a country still dominated by Junkers. This ambiguous view of bourgeois rights is not corrected by the 4th paragraph. The only part of Quintessenz which deals with this position. Quote, the bourgeois freedoms, e.g. free trade, free entry to education, free vote, etc., are of no use to the proletarian because in capitalist society he is prevented from using them by his class situation, end quote. Korsch. The formulation does not deal adequately with the relation between the law, rights, and the productive system in which the law operates. There seems to be only a contingent connection between the sociological position of workers and their access to law. But in the Marxist system, there is quite a different relation between law and the production process. I now wish to show this difference, first by examining Korsch's conception of the nature of law. His early career had shown that he was not very interested in the practice of law, but if anything, in jurisprudence. His own professional career was in the academic study of jurisprudence. From 1919, he was lecturing at the University of Jena on related topics. For example, in the winter semester of 1920/21, he held seminars on Hegel's philosophy of law, and in the following winter on the problems of the law and the state. He was eventually appointed professor of civil law at the University of Jena. Even then, he did not write a general treatise on the relations between law and Marxism. In the early 1930s, he wrote his one article on the nature of law, a review of works by the Austro-Marxist Renner, I think it's Karl Renner, and the Soviet jurist Pashukanis. I think I might actually have Korsch's comments on Pashukanis on this channel. I think it might have been included as an appendix for Marxism and Theory of Law, or whatever the book is called, Pashukanis' big book. I think it might have been an appendix in the copy that I read. In this, he suggests that Lukács's argument that philosophy as a form of reified consciousness can be applied to law. Quote, until the present time, a clear recognition by Marxists of the fact, clearly expressed by Marx, was lacking, namely that even in its so-called, even in its form, so-called, quote, law, bracket, rect, and bracket, was only a more fetishistically distorted form of the same social realities which make their first fetishized appearance in the form of the commodity, end quote. Korsch. However, in the early 1920s, Korsch's analysis had not reached such a sophisticated level, but his general position at this period can be reconstructed. Quote, law, or rect, forms part of the superstructure. In Korsch's, quote, diagrammatic representation of human society, end quote, he locates it as part of the, quote, superstructure on the same level as, quote, morals and, quote, customs. And then there's a little chart here that has that says has a line going from left to right on either side of the left of this chart. On top of the line it says superstructure, beneath the line it says space, so superstructure being on top of base. And categorized with superstructure are ideas in men's heads, law, morals, customs, church, school, free professions, family, state. And the base is the economic order. If the diagram represents a series of stages, then presumably the lowest level, family and state, is most closely connected with the, quote, base economy, and as one ascends, the autonomy of ideology increases till one reaches the, quote, ideas in men's heads, end quote. But in every case, ideology is a part of reality. There can be no question of the ideological superstructure undergoing a substantial change, independently of a change of the, quote, base. On this question, Marx had stated definitively that, quote, right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby, end quote. Before assessing Korsch's ideas on law, as outlined in the book or pamphlet, Labor Law for Factory Councils, it would be useful to describe Marx's position and use that as a touchstone. Marx considered that the problem of accounting for the existence of law and the state was one of the key problems which led him to his materialist conception of history. Quote, legal relations, Rechtsverhältnisse, as well as forms of state, are to be grasped neither from themselves nor from ... the development ... of the mind, but rather have their roots in the material conditions of life. End quote. Marx. Unfortunately, Marx never applied to law itself the methodological outlines he had gained in this way through his studies of law. Yet it is possible to conjecture how he would have approached this question. Marx would not have aimed at giving a sociological critique of law, i.e., how the law served the interests of certain classes, or, at a more empirical level, at investigating the class background of members of the judiciary. This is because Marx had a more fundamental aim, to show the relations between law and the, quote, material conditions of life, on which classes were themselves grounded. In the idealist system, law and rights were held to embody certain eternal human values. In Marx's system, they were grounded in definite stages in the development of society. In the bourgeois revolution, the demand for certain rights, although held to be desirable in itself by those putting forward the demand, objectively had the effect of promoting bourgeois property relations. In future, the demands put forward in the context of the proletarian revolution would, in the classical Marxist schema, have a different orientation. The following passage from Marx may help to clarify this point. Quote, "The right to work is in the bourgeois sense nonsense, a wretched pious wish. But behind the right to work stands the power over capital. Behind power over capital, the appropriation of the means of production, their subjection to the associated working class, that is, the abolition of wage labor, capital, and their mutual relationship." End quote. Marx. In short, Marxism argues that any attempt by the working class to use the law to protect and advance its interests comes into conflict with the fundamental relations of exploitation. Based on a supposed connection between law and the organization of production, it demands a reorganization of society in an after which law can play only a secondary role. I now wish to assess Korsch's ideas on labor law in the light of this brief attempt to distinguish between a sociological and a Marxist explanation of the law. In criticizing his general approach to the question of law, I should not look for differences with the conventional jurist. Even if relevant, this would be an enormous task, since the law elicited a great deal of legal commentary. Further, Korsch himself did not concentrate on the interpretation of the law by conventional jurists, since Korsch was mainly concerned with arguing against the reformist conceptions of the SPD. Korsch attempted to demonstrate that the views of the SPD and the bourgeoisie in fact coincided. Like the conventional jurists, the SPD commentators claimed to discuss the matter objectively, giving equal weight to arguments favorable and unfavorable to the employers. Korsch did not directly challenge the idea that the law can be analyzed objectively. Instead, Korsch disputed the practical conclusions drawn by the SPD. In so doing, he had a tendency to align himself on the side of the, quote, class struggle. Quote, our piece, Labor Law for Factory Councils, is, from its first to its last page, oriented to the revolutionary class struggle, end quote. Korsch. Korsch warned that the factory councils could be used to get the majority of the workers to comply with the schemes for participation with the employers, Arbeitsgemeinschaft, which the moderate trade union leaders preferred. In his opinion, the councils should instead be considered as, quote, the most advanced outposts of the proletarian army, as the real battlefields in an economic and social struggle, which at the same time necessarily means a political struggle, end quote. Korsch. Their role is to promote the class struggle, precisely the opposite of the aim of the moderate leaders of the SPD and the trade unions who preferred a policy of cooperation. Thus, in Korsch's view, the factory councils were not merely, quote, auxiliary organs in the trade union struggle to maintain the workers' standard of living within the existing capitalist order, but were also to be the advanced position of the revolutionary movement. They already were a weapon of control over the running of the factory. In this sense, quote, the council's movement appears no longer as just a preparatory action for the coming major battle of the social revolution, but as the real and definite beginning of this decisive social battle itself, unquote. Korsch. But the factory councils were only a temporary foothold. He opposed the, quote, reformist notion that the factory councils and the laws relating to them could represent a permanent gain for the working class. He claimed that they were a concession given by the industrialists in their hour of danger, when it seemed that they might be engulfed by the popular wave of protest at the end of the war. Concessions were made in the hope of averting even more threatening dangers. This was so not only in this case, but in general. Quote, undoubtedly, the decisive motive for all previous social policy, however honest the intentions and motives of individual bourgeois reformers may have been, has been for the most part the pressure of the proletarian class, end quote. Korsch. Reforms are conceded in order to diffuse potentially dangerous movements of popular protest. For example, at the same time as the anti-socialist laws, there was legislation on social insurance. In reviewing the history of social policy, Korsch mentions various motives for the concession of reforms. The reform of housing conditions, for instance, was motivated by the fear that the epidemics caused by poor conditions would spread to the more affluent residential districts. Other improvements in the dietary and housing conditions of the working class were carried out to ensure an adequate supply of healthy recruits to the army. Thus, like other reforms, the factory councils would not be a permanent concession to the working class. Korsch warned that, quote, the German capitalist class which tolerated, quote, cooperation, bracket, Arbeitsgemeinschaft, in bracket, as long as it needed it as a buffer between itself and the movement of the masses, is today already preparing its withdrawal from cooperation and from all, quote, cooperative institutions of the new Germany, end quote. Korsch. Korsch illustrated this point with examples from a memorandum titled On the Economic Constitution of Germany, issued by the employers in May 1922, which seemed to support his point. He claimed that the greatest danger for the working class would be not to use the factory councils for political ends. He claimed that the greatest danger for the working class would be not to use the factory councils for political ends. The greatest danger would be, quote, to fill the legal factory councils with a, quote, cooperative spirit, and to begin to consider them as members of a so-called, quote, common economy, end quote, resting on the fraternization between capital and labor, end quote. Korsch. The notion of, quote, anchoring the councils into the Constitution was quite utopian and, quote, even this distorted caricature of a, quote, council system promised by Article 165 of the Constitution was for the reactionary forces which have reconstituted themselves more and more powerfully since 1920 still too much to tolerate. End quote. Korsch. Korsch decisively rejected a reformist, quote, social policy approach to the factory councils. This is hardly surprising. What is more significant is Korsch's tendency to be sympathetic towards the anarchist syndicalists. He notes that even before the war, they had at least recognized the possibilities for direct control over production by the working class. The traditional party of the working class, the reformist SPD, had entirely ignored such possibilities. And so right there, that seems like already like a even though he's not a council communist yet, this very like latent sympathy that he has for syndicalist forms. And to keep in mind, council communists, even though they developed their distinct theory and definitely drew influence from the industrial workers of the world as like a model, which is distinct from trade unionism. Granted, they had they went beyond this into a lot of ways, but they definitely viewed they definitely had a sympathy. There was definitely overlap and sympathy between the ideas of syndicalism and council communism. Anyway, so far I've reviewed Korsch's general notion of Marxism and his rejection of the reformist views on the factory councils. I'll now turn to the main ideas of labor law for factory councils itself. The detailed legal commentary on the factory councils law, which forms the second part of the book, will be referred to only insofar as it adds to or explains more clearly the argument of the first, more theoretical part. The first part of his argument is that the antithesis between the bourgeois and proletarian classes leads to opposed notions of labor law. Quote, the bourgeois class considers the whole labor law essentially from the standpoint of the, quote, contract of labor. By contrast, the proletarian class considers it essentially under that of the, quote, constitution of labor, end quote. Korsch. What is meant by these two notions, quote, contract of labor and, quote, constitution of labor? In discussing contract of labor, Korsch does no more than repeat Marx's argument that while the worker may be a free and equal citizen in the democratic republic, in the economic sphere he is neither free nor equal. The, quote, contract of labor, end quote, apparently a free contract between equals, rests on a real inequality in the sphere of production between those who own the means of production and those who do not. The concept of, quote, constitution of labor, end quote, refers to certain developments in capitalism which have taken place since Marx's death. The explication of this concept forms the central thesis of labor law for factory councils. This central thesis depends upon a certain periodization of capitalism, i.e. that the contemporary period is a transitional one between capitalism and socialism. Since this notion of the transitional period is crucial to Korsch's whole outlook during this period, and since it is also the basic underlying conception of the book Marxism and Philosophy, it must be examined before a detailed analysis of labor law for factory councils can be made. The idea that the epoch beginning around 1900 was a transitional one between capitalism and socialism formed an essential part of Comintern doctrine. It had first been put forward in Lenin's book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which argued that important changes in the nature of capitalism had begun to appear around the year 1900. Previously, the driving force of capitalism was free competition. In the imperialist stage, free competition had been replaced by the operation of the giant monopolies which dominated the economy. Consequently, capitalism showed a tendency to stagnate by comparison with its earlier stage. Lenin summarized this development as follows, quote, "Capitalism in its imperialist stage leads directly to the most comprehensive socialization of production. It, so to speak, drags the capitalist against their will and consciousness into some sort of new social order, a transitional one from complete free competition to complete socialization," end quote. Lenin. In this transitional epoch between capitalism and socialism, capitalism will be continually beset by economic crises, leading to, quote, "wars and revolutions," end quote. In Lenin's analysis of imperialism, the changes in the production process are considered primary. The probability of, quote, "wars and revolutions," end quote, is derived from this economic analysis. But Lenin did not think that there was a mechanical, rigidly determinist connection between economics and politics. The, quote, "death agony" of capitalism may be prolonged, and capitalism might revive to enjoy periods of sustained growth if a revolutionary party did not succeed in leading the working class to overthrow capitalism. Lenin's argument is both concrete in that it is based on a detailed economic analysis and cautious in its estimation that capitalism is not inevitably doomed. The more messianic and utopian followers of Lenin in the 1920s lacked his concreteness and his caution. Lukács, for example, boldly proclaimed the actuality of the revolution. Korsch simply asserted, quote, "At the beginning of the 20th century, the long period of purely evolutionary development of capitalism came to an end, and a new epoch of revolutionary struggle began," end quote. Korsch. Korsch does not explain the concept of imperialism in any detail, perhaps because Korsch thought it too well known in communist circles to require explanation. In one passage, Korsch does mention the objective basis of imperialism. Quote, "In the beginning of the 20th century, it became evident that the development of imperialism had created the objective preconditions for a enormous intensification of class antagonisms," end quote. Korsch. But in none of his references to the imperialist epoch does Korsch attempt to explain the particular significance of the economic changes which underlie it. Instead, he concentrates on its political aspects. The, quote, "dictatorship of the proletariat," quote, "increased class struggle." To use the Marxist terminology, he only referred to the superstructural features of the epoch, an epoch in which in all areas of society, two hostile classes confront each other without either being more than temporarily dominant. Thus, his conception of the transitional epoch is not explicitly stated. The few references Korsch does make to the, quote, "transitional period," Übergangsphase, show that his conception may differ significantly from Lenin's. In the piece, Labor Law for Factory Councils, he compared the transitional period between capitalism and socialism to the period of the absolute monarchy, which represented a transition between capitalism and feudalism. This comparison is more clearly stated, however, in a newspaper article which, by means of a journalistic conceit, expresses the idea more sharply. Quote, "Just as formerly the French Sun King, in the epoch of the greatest splendor of the absolute monarchy, which today seems to be a rather brief transitional period between the medieval state based on the estates, Ständestaat, and the modern bourgeois constitutional state, called out in the full glory of its rule, 'I am the state,' so too did his powerful successors, King Stennis and company, declare the same." I think Stennis is like a manufacturer. "Standing on the summit of the epoch of capitalist domination and proclaiming the absolute preeminence of their social leadership over the democratic republic which has sunk to the level of a formal state," end quote. End quote. Korsch. This comparison is itself the conclusion of an argument about the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions. The difference between them is as follows. Bourgeois society had to overthrow the tyranny of some forms of religion and state, but had not been able to achieve a comparable liberation in the economic sphere, so that, quote, "the historical task of the struggle of the proletarian class against the bourgeoisie and all older social classes consists, in abolishing the unfreedom of the working man in production, and thus destroying the basis of capitalist domination," end quote. Korsch. Korsch considers that the proletarian revolution is not totally different from the bourgeois revolution, only its, quote, "deepening." Vertiefung. Within this general schema, there is a great deal of complexity. The evolution of bourgeois rights was a lengthy process. Quote, "The political freedom and equality of all state citizens in the democratic republic today was not won by the bourgeois revolution with one blow," end quote. Korsch. In feudal society, decisive political power is to be found in the hands of the upper estates, Stände. This period is followed by that of the absolute monarchy, in which political power is held by one person alone, the absolute monarch. This represents a balance of forces between the declining estates and the rising bourgeoisie. The first step away from this towards democracy is the attainment of a written constitution limiting the rights of absolutism, i.e., a constitutional monarch in which the monarch has control over ministers. Finally, in a parliamentary monarchy, the ruler is merely, quote, the dot on the I, end quote. The most complete form of political freedom is the democratic republic. Yet even in the most democratic republic, the struggles between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, quote, only apparently turn around the domination of the state. In their innermost essentials, they turn on the domination of the economy, i.e. the, quote, constitution of labor, end quote. This scheme is completed by a transitional period in which the bourgeoisie imposes its dictatorship in periods of crisis, and the proletariat attempts to replace this by its own dictatorship in the transitional period from capitalism to communism. Eventually, this results in the communist society, free associations, in a state, and the classless society. In this schema, economic and political developments do not run parallel. Quote, the same development which has, in the course of history, been completed in the, quote, superstructure of the state community is completed in a different tempo of development and in partly different forms in the economic base of this political community, in the, quote, community of labor, end quote, Korsch. The individual phases of the, quote, community of labor, end quote, occur later than the corresponding phases of political development. For instance, despotism is the rule in the factory after it has disappeared from the political scene. At the present stage, too, economics lags behind political developments. The present constitution of labor in such countries as Germany and Austria can be characterized as a, quote, constitutionalism of the professions, end quote. Bracket, gewerblicher Konstitutionalismus, end bracket, still in its first stages. The monarchical rulers of the factories still exist even if they are for the most part no longer sovereigns totally independent of each other, but are united in leagues and kingdoms, end quote. Korsch. Whereas the reformist politicians and trade union leaders had imagined that the growth of large enterprises would lead to a democratization of the economy, precisely the opposite had occurred. The large entrepreneurs were able to exercise their despotism all the more easily. The rights of co-determination attained by the workers in the sphere of the, quote, community of labor, end quote, fall into three groups in the following historical sequence. First, in the sphere of social policy, the workers' gains do not affect them directly as workers, but only indirectly as, quote, citizens of the state, end quote. These, quote, social policy concessions were granted for the reasons discussed above. The second limitation on the capitalist as, quote, master in his own house, end quote, is exercised by the trade union organization of the working class. The workers gain a right of, quote, co-determination of their conditions of work as owners and sellers of the commodity labor power. The third and most recent form of limitation on the absolute powers of the factory owners is the, quote, co-determination rights, end quote, gained for the workers as such, as members of a productive unit, the factory. The first weak indications of this were the German factory laws of the 1890s, which were strengthened in the years at the end of and after the war. Regarding the law and factory councils, Korsch reaches the following conclusion. Quote, despite all the concessions already made by the bourgeois mind in the present epoch of transition, there's really no room for the concept of a, quote, constitution of labor, end quote, within the framework of bourgeois law, end quote, Korsch. Yet at the same time, consistent with the general transitional character of the present epoch, the present system of law also has a transitional character. Thus he argues, quote, the universal character of the transition, which takes place in the present epoch, naturally must also be expressed in the legal consciousness. In this epoch, the old purely bourgeois standpoint of private law cannot be maintained, nor the new purely proletarian standpoint of social law, end quote. Korsch. The law would govern the relations between, quote, collectives rather than between individuals. For example, the law governing the relations between trade unions and the employers' federations. In his inaugural professional lecture, Korsch makes this point even more explicitly. The greatest part of what the bourgeois jurist regards as labor law is, quote, on the whole, no longer bourgeois law and cannot be, I think there's a typo here. It says, quote, is on the whole on longer bourgeois law and cannot be subsumed under the so-called public law of the present-day bourgeois society. I think it's no longer, not on longer. The greatest part of what the bourgeois jurist regards as labor law, quote, is on the whole no longer bourgeois law and cannot be, subsumed under the so-called public law of present-day bourgeois society, end quote. What is it being replaced by? Quote, in labor law, the old, law of declining bourgeois society and the declining bourgeois state is opposed within this state and society by the new proletarian law of the working class. Just as in classical natural law from Grotius to Hegel, the, rigid law of declining feudal society was opposed by the new bourgeois law of the third estate, end quote. The, quote, constitutional, or rather, quote, pseudo-constitutional character of the present organization of the economy is most clearly revealed by the constitution of the individual factory, as laid down in the Factory Council's laws and other related laws. What strategy follows from this analysis? The faltering steps taken in the direction of, quote, industrial democracy, end quote, by the concession of a written constitution and the right to consultation must be made more decisive. That the relation between workers and factory owners is written down in the Factory Council's law is an achievement analogous to that of a written constitution. But there are limits to this process of democratization, end quote. Today it is not yet possible to speak of the full achievement of, quote, industrial democracy, end quote. The development of freedom in the community of labor has not even reached, quote, parliamentarism, end quote, end quote. Korsch. The argument is concluded as follows. Just as in the political, quote, community of labor, end quote, a phase of constitutionalism was only a transitional period between absolute monarchy and complete bourgeois democracy, so too in the development of the constitution of the, quote, community of labor, end quote, there must follow a phase of complete, quote, industrial democracy, end quote. He warns that anyone who believes that, through a planned development of all these various forms of the co-determination of the workers in production and conditions of work, quote, the desired, quote, industrial democracy, end quote, in the community of labor can be fully realized without a violent overthrow of the existing bourgeois democratic state institutions. Is overlooking the immense difference between the bourgeois capitalist state as the, quote, ideal capitalist as a whole, end quote, and the state of the proletarian dictatorship as the, quote, collective proletarian ideal, end quote, Korsch. Capitalism places certain insuperable limits on the development of such co-determination rights. They mainly develop insofar as they do not clash with the profit-making interest of the capitalist class. If these rights ever become more than bridgeheads for the attack on capitalism, then they will be withdrawn by the capitalist class. The main immediate practical consequence of this strategy was that the factory councils are not to be considered mainly as auxiliary organs, Hilfsorgane, of the economic struggle. They are of decisive importance in the struggles for the control of production. This does not mean that trade union organization according to profession, Berufsverband, is quite unsuitable. But to serve revolutionary ends, the normal form of trade union organizations should be transformed into industrial unions, Industrieverbände. The argument about industrial unions is rather involved, so it will not be pursued here. I shall now evaluate Korsch's ideas in the piece Labor Law for Factory Councils using the criterion of Marx's views on law. Marx's basic argument was that the evolution of law does not depend on the self-development of certain legal concepts, but is conditioned by the development of the forces of production. Korsch does not accept this standpoint wholeheartedly. Formally, he does recognize the necessity of an analysis in terms of political economy. For instance, he argues that in order to understand the root cause of the lack of freedom for workers in the democratic republic, quote, we must, following Marx's teaching, descend into the most fundamental stratum of human life, which is denoted as the, quote, economic, end quote, Korsch. Korsch goes on to say that Marx's critique of political economy gave an insight into the political significance of economic facts. Beneath the deceptive surface of freedom and equality, he revealed the economic unfreedom of the propertyless wage worker. His analysis revealed the ambiguous character of the freedom gained by the modern wage worker in the, quote, contract of labor, end quote. He is free in that he is no longer a slave, but he is also, quote, free of the means of production, so that, if he is to survive, he must subject himself to someone else economically. This argument does agree formally with the Marxist text, if at a rather elementary level. Korsch does not go on to use this criterion of political economy to trace the connection between the productive process and the law in this particular case. His analysis remains at such a level of generality that it could apply to any law. By contrast, Marx displays both the necessary abstraction and concreteness which is lacking in Korsch. This can best be seen in Marx's criticism of the English Factory Acts of 1833 to 64. As an extension of his earlier general critique of law and rights, Marx attempted to relate the introduction of new legislation to the continued process of accumulation of capital. The effect of legal regulation of conditions is to introduce order, uniformity, and economy into the individual factory, and in so doing to give an impetus to the introduction of technical improvements. Quote, by maturing the material conditions and the combination on a social scale of the processes of production, it matures the contradictions and antagonisms of the capitalist form of production, and thereby provides, along with the elements for the formation of a new society, the forces for exploding the old one. End quote. Marx. When Korsch is a formally when Korsch is a formally correct position, he's not able to apply his analysis. On other occasions, when Korsch does attempt to trace a connection between the economy and law, he does not use the same criterion as Marx. Despite his formal criticisms, he essentially accepts the, quote, bourgeois conception of rights and law and simply wishes to extend it to all spheres of social life. As he himself admitted, he saw the proletarian revolution as merely the, quote, deepening of the bourgeois revolution. This is clearly evident when Korsch writes, quote, for this demand, bracket, i.e. industrial democracy, in bracket, the working class can bring into the field all those arguments which the bourgeois class itself developed in its struggle against the despotism of princes and the privileges of estates, for a liberal state constitution and for, quote, political democracy, end quote. That is, the same kind of rights workers enjoy as citizens must be extended to the sphere of work, because, quote, the capitalist, who may outside his factory be enthusiastic about freedom and human rights, still wants to remain very much, quote, master in his own house, end quote. Marx, on the other hand, when discussing the right to work, saw a qualitative distinction between the bourgeois conception of rights and his own. The socialist demand for rights should not concentrate, therefore, on, quote, more of the same, end quote, nor on extending legislation, etc. Korsch's comparison of the modern factory owner with the absolute despot reveals a failure to understand the position of the individual capitalists within the production process according to the Marxist system. Korsch holds an ambiguous position on this matter. On two occasions, Korsch does recognize that capitalists are subject to some external laws independent of their will. The partial truth in Korsch's argument is that the individual entrepreneur does hold unlimited sway within the factory. But, as the passage quoted clearly indicates, Marx is concerned with the laws governing production as a whole, to which the entrepreneur is himself subject. The absolute monarch, on the other hand, is not subject to such pressures at all. Whatever agitational value the comparison between the power or wealth of the absolute monarchy and that of the German capitalist may have, it is not soundly based on a Marxist analysis of the personal role of capitalists in the production process. Just a side note, it seems like you could make an argument, although it's not the same as the mercantile pressures that are put on, the commercial pressures put upon capitalists, but there is a impersonal kind of political pressures placed on various monarchs, various, including like absolute monarchs, right? There's there is the fact that they exist in a larger world, a larger world society, world civilization, means that they are compelled to act in certain ways other than just mere caprice. But that's just a side note for myself. This confusion about the nature of this law, was it to be entirely ignored while the factory councils were used to further the revolutionary struggle? Or could it be utilized, was not peculiar to Korsch, but was shared by the KPD. In a resolution submitted to the 11th Congress of the German Trade Unions, the KPD proposed, quote, the Congress requests the National Executive to work out a new Factory Councils law within 2 months, ... The draft law shall establish, ... thoroughgoing control of production, trade, and commerce, end quote. KPD. Korsch's notion of, quote, industrial democracy, end quote, is in fact surprisingly similar to that held by two writers not otherwise sympathetic to his political aims, namely Sidney Webb and Otto Bauer. In the case of Sidney Webb, the similarity extends even down to the terms used. Quote, the captains of industry, like the kings of yore, are honestly unable to understand why their personal power should be interfered with, and kings and captains alike have never found any difficulty in demonstrating that its maintenance was indispensable to society. Against this autocracy in industry, the manual workers have, during this century, increasingly made good their protest. The agitation for freedom of combination in factory legislation has been in reality a demand for a, quote, constitution in the industrial realm, end quote. Webb. And it makes sense, right? It wasn't Korsch like, I mean, obviously this is later in his life, but it wasn't, to my understanding, Korsch, was influenced by Fabianism, right? And Webb being a Fabian, Sidney and Beatrice Webb being like the king and queen of Fabianism in Great Britain. There's also a very remarkable similarity to Otto Bauer's Der Weg zum Sozialismus. This contains a schema of rights for factory workers which is almost identical to Korsch's, as can be seen in, for instance, the following passage, quote, by the establishment of factory committees, we arrive in the factory at a constitutional monarchy. Legal sovereignty is shared between the boss, who governs the enterprise like the hereditary monarch, and the factory committee, which plays the role of parliament. Beyond this stage, one goes on to the Republican constitution of industry. The boss disappears. The economic and technical direction of each branch of industry is entrusted to an administrative council, end quote. Otto Bauer. But to understand why Korsch draws such similar political conclusions, we must examine Korsch's analysis more closely. Labor law for factory councils is not simply a continuation of What is Socialization, the book What is Socialization, which stood even closer to Bauer and Webb. It does contain one new idea which is formally much more in line with his new political affiliation, i.e. the notion of the transitional epoch. Korsch's understanding of this idea is open to two objections. The first concerns the central notion of, quote, social law, Sozialrecht. If Korsch was merely arguing that the pressure of the working class movement in the post-war period had enabled it to gain considerable legal concessions, e.g. the legal recognition of workers' organizations, a concession which seemed to break with the traditional concept that law applied to private individuals only and not collectives, then this would be partly untrue and rather uninteresting. But Korsch's argument is more ambitious. It is that a new principle of law has already begun to replace the old, quote, social law instead of, quote, private law. In my opinion, this reveals a mistaken understanding of Lenin's concept of the transitional epoch. It attempts to extend the application of this concept from economic to cultural problems, i.e. legal and political rights. To use the Marxist terminology, his argument rests on an analogy between base and superstructure, just as the monopoly organization of production means the replacement of the individualistic production of the laissez-faire era by socialized production. So too, in the realm of individualism is replaced by more collective conceptions. Large-scale socialist production has an embryonic existence in the organization of large monopolies. Likewise, socialist ideology exists embryonically in such principles as, quote, social law. Although Korsch formally acknowledges that such possibilities can only be fully realized under the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, Korsch still claims that the new principle already exists. Korsch takes this argument to its practical conclusion. The essential task for the working class is, quote, to maintain those positions at which today a conflict between the bourgeois legal and the social legal conception of the labor relation has already broken out, or at least is about to break out. In the second place, In all these particular positions, the attempt must be made to draw the consequences of the social legal conception with a sharpness corresponding to the present historical situation. End quote. Korsch. The conclusion does follow. This conclusion does follow from his argument. Is the basic argument which is mistaken. The mistake lies in the assumption that whatever may be said about the quote base may also be said about the quote superstructure. This criticism of Korsch's position is of course independent of the validity of the arguments of Lenin's imperialism. Korsch's notion goes against the more dialectical relation of base to superstructure, of ideology to reality, which he was to argue for in the book Marxism and Philosophy. Whereas Marx would argue that ideas can persist long after their material base has disappeared, Korsch appears to argue the converse, that in fact ideas can anticipate changes in the material base. This erroneous argument may explain why Korsch's understanding of how the transition to socialism is to be achieved is unclear. In one passage, Korsch suggests that, quote, in the epoch politically characterized as the transitional period of the, quote, proletarian dictatorship, a proletarian constitution of labor, resting on the firm foundation of, quote, industrial democracy, end quote, with it a real council system will, after long, difficult, and ruthless struggles in the whole economy, and in all individual branches of the economy, and in every individual factory, be gradually realized by the state power placed at the service of the proletarian class, unquote. Korsch. This is a curiously, quote, gradualist statement for a, quote, revolutionary Marxist to make, but at least it does indicate some sort of strategy for the transition to socialism. On other occasions, he merely draws an idealized contrast between the present situation and an imagined future. The fulfillment of the economic and political demands requires the construction of a system of economic councils controlled by the proletarian state. He then quotes from the, quote, labor code of the Soviet Union and presents an ideal schema describing how a system of economic councils would work. This is the ideal. He then compares this to the less acceptable reality of the current German situation, in which the councils were being anchored into the constitution. He does not mention any strategy by which the present factory councils could play a role in the concrete transition from unacceptable reality to the utopian ideal. He simply proposes that they play a, quote, class struggle, unquote, role instead of a, quote, cooperative role. In some respects, the piece, I guess this is a pamphlet, the labor law for factory councils does not deal with any of the concrete problems that the factory councils were facing. It deals with the question of workers' rights, the relation of the factory councils to the political councils, and the need for industrial unions. But because it does not deal satisfactorily with the abstract problem of the relation of law to production, it is unable to produce a concrete program dealing with the problems facing the German proletariat at that time, such as inflation and the maintenance of working-class living standards. Korsch can say in general terms that what is needed is an orientation to, quote, class struggle, but in only one instance does Korsch say what the content of the class struggle was at that period. It concerned, quote, resistance to longer hours of work, unbearable tax burdens, and the struggle for bread, end quote. Korsch. Korsch only makes a brief mention of the fact that at the period there were important struggles by the working class for the control of prices and production. Korsch was perfectly well aware of these struggles, for he wrote about them for the KPD's newspapers. It is strange, then, that he does not indicate how, in a concrete manner, the factory councils might be used to assist the prices committees in the struggle for control over production. In this chapter, we have seen that Korsch attempted to apply the Leninist conception of imperialism as a transitional epoch to the nature and development of labor law, especially as applied to the relations between worker and employer. I have shown that Korsch was not entirely successful in this attempt. By the criterion of consistency with Marxism, his quintessence does not show an adequate understanding of the relation between law and the economic system. Thus, when he comes to apply his notion of Marxism to current problems, he adopts quite erroneous positions. More generally, he has an idiosyncratic view of the relationship between, in the Marxist terminology, quote, base and, quote, superstructure. This has not been fully examined here, for it is more relevant to the next chapter, in which we will see how Korsch thought that, just as Lenin had rediscovered the orthodox version of Marxist theory of the state, he himself had succeeded in a similar restoration of Marx's concept of philosophy. And that's the end of Chapter 3 of Karl Korsch, A Study in Western Marxism by Patrick Goode. Thank you so much for listening.